on the logic that underlies the special registration program. There was no evidence, and in fact, as Deepa mentioned, no one was charged with the crime of terrorism under the special registration program. So again, the government was preemptively targeting Muslims based on the belief that they were inherently predisposed to committing acts of violence. So that's important to keep in mind, not just when we're thinking about this idea of special registration, but when we think about all of the policies that have been implemented and which may be implemented under President-elect Trump's administration. Now, because this audience is so large and so diverse, and I think I'm going to guess that we're sort of relatively aware of the rise of hate crimes, in particular after President-elect Trump came into power, I believe that it's really important to make a distinct and solid connection between state policy and hate crimes. So state policy effectively serves to model treatment of a particular target group, which then society looks to in terms of how they should also treat this particular target group. So they're not discrete. So when we think about a policy such as special registration, we think of the government registering 80 to 90,000 men. And what signal does that send to the society? It sends the signal or the message that Muslims are largely terrorists. And what does that mean in terms of how we can treat these individuals within our society? So we need to start thinking about the connections between state policy and hate crimes, because we really can't address, combat, or challenge one without realizing the ways in which they are both affected by the other. For those of you who aren't aware in terms of how the level of hate crimes that Muslims have been subjected to over the last 15 years, prior to 2001, the numbers of hate crimes, at least those which were reported by the FBI, were about mid-20s to 32 at the highest. In 2001, that number rose to 481, and thereafter, the number has not gone below 100 in terms of the number of hate crimes that Muslims have experienced. So it's important to think about what may happen in the future in terms of what we may see with an administration that has already been much more explicit about the need to target Muslims. We can only imagine that this might actually become significantly worse. So again, realizing this connection between policy and hate crimes. So I don't want to talk for too much longer, but what also ties all of this together is really this idea of institutional and structural Islamophobia. So what that means is that all of these policies are bound together and are implemented in policy based on this set of premises and constructions of Muslims as terrorists. It also means that we can't view policies in isolation from one another, that they are interconnected, that they rely on the same rationales and the same premises. They rely on the same premise that Muslims are dangerous, right? So I spoke to you briefly about many of the policies that have been implemented under this, quote, war on terror. What ties all of this together is the fact that we have significant and increasing Islamophobia. Now, there are numerous definitions of Islamophobia. I'd encourage you to, kind of look at what Islamophobia this term is meant to articulate. But when I think about Islamophobia, I think about it as sort of a unique type of sort of anti-religious animus at the nexus of sort of this xenophobia, racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and many other things, nationalism. So I'll read you what I have sort of come up with as a term for what I think Islamophobia is meant to articulate. This is not to say that this is the only right way or the only way in which we conceive of what Islamophobia is, but to say that we have to understand what we are talking about when we're talking about institutional and structural Islamophobia, and what does that mean? And what are the ways in which we can imagine Muslims being targeted based on how they have already been targeted? So, my definition of Islamophobia is as follows. Islamophobia is a phenomenon meant to articulate contrived hate of Muslims that is built into structures of the state and society for the pursuit of power and the justification of war and repression. Islamophobia is based on the social construction of Islam as violent, barbaric, uncivilized, and opposed to normative democratic values, and exists as a system of dehumanization of Muslims, which results in consequences ranging from prejudice to discrimination, detention, and even death. Intersectional identities of Muslims along various racial, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic lines makes the source of Islamophobia difficult to distinctly isolate. However, Islamophobia represents a particular type of oppression as it operates at the nexus of anti-religious animus and racism, cultural racism, nationalism, and xenophobia. Islamophobia is maintained and perpetuated by white supremacy, which upholds notions of dichotomous ideological values between the West and Islam. So I know that that's a rather dense definition of Islamophobia, but I wanted to offer it in terms of how we understand or begin to understand what Islamophobia really is. That we can't understand it as simply racism, or we can't understand it as simply anti-religious animus. That we have to understand the complexities. And it's the complexities that help us understand what it is about policy and what it is about the Muslim identity that is being targeted vis-a-vis policies under the War on Terror. So in terms of more or less the concrete manifestations of institutional Islamophobia, we've already spoken to this special registration program, and I've already given you sort of a set of other policies. But what I also see happening in the course of the War on Terror and in the course of institutionalizing Islamophobia, that certain things become acceptable. These things include sidelining the law or rewriting the law in order to further criminalize or target Muslims. So in other words, there have been many instances in which Muslims simply exist outside of the law. Clear examples include for Guantanamo Bay Prison. Guantanamo Bay prisoners were initially considered to be not to be prisoners of war and therefore not entitled to protections under the Geneva Conventions. This meant that they were subjected to torture. Moreover, under the Bush administration, torture was redefined as abuse rising to the level of organ failure or death. In other words, anything short of organ failure or death was not considered torture. This is the treatment that Muslims have been subjected to. We might think of it as much more egregious than other policies we've seen implemented, but it's the egregious policies that exist as an example of what could happen and what legitimizes what has happened. We know under the War on Terror that Muslims have been subjected to many policies that seriously and significantly dehumanize this identity. So when we think about policy, when we think about law, we have to think broader than that. We have to think about challenging policy and law, not only by using the system of law, not only by using the system of justice, but working outside of that. Because that is precisely what has happened in the last 15 years. we're not working with a justice system that is meant to protect the rights of Muslims. So, bringing it back briefly to the special registration program, obviously it's our hope that this program is not revived and that we can finally put an end to a program that's not only ineffective, but which targets Muslims. So really, there's no purpose and no utility in this policy. So we're going to talk to you a little bit more, I'm going to hand it over in a second, about what work we're kind of doing as a group of Muslim women in the local DC area. But I really just want to emphasize really looking at the broader context, right? Thinking about not only which policies are being explicitly named as ones that may continue, but looking beyond that to see what is already happening, what has already continued, and what may be continued behind closed doors. So I want to thank you all again for being here today. I'm really hoping that we can all sort of work together in the future and really build a movement to resist these, not only the Muslim registries again, but all of the policies that have criminalized Muslims under the war on terror. Thank you so much.